Hey everybody, Miss Dietrich here. We're going to be talking about lesson 3.6, which is on compare absolute value, which can be found, your homework is on page 175. Let's look at a simple example. We talked about this in class a little bit, and we'll use the example of your scuba diving or your snorkeling. And if you're at sea level, you would be right at 0. So let's say I was to go snorkeling just because I'm a little bit afraid to go scuba diving, and I'm willing to go at a depth of negative 15 feet. So let's put a D for Dietrich, because that would be me. And let's say we had Mrs. Hayes, who has a little more equipment. Maybe she's got the actual full-on scuba diving equipment. And let's say she's willing to go down to a depth of negative 40 feet. We'll put an H for Hayes. And we're trying to figure out who has more depth. So would it be Dietrich or Hayes? And we'll put that little comparison, the circle where we usually put in the little comparison symbol. All right, now what we should first look at is the idea of, let's look at the lines that represent how deep I would be. So my line is represented in yellow. And if we look at Mrs. Hayes, let's draw her line in purple. So her line is that long. So if we were to just kind of take these away and just look and see which one is a longer line, isn't Mrs. Hayes's line, the purple line, longer than my yellow line? So just an initial look, you can see that she would have more depth. But how do we represent that using mathematical symbols and all the math stuff that you would have to fill into a white space? So really what we're talking about here is we're talking about absolute value. So mine would be the absolute value of a negative 15. Mrs. Hayes is the absolute value of a negative 40. And when we simplify that, this is 15 feet deep. And this is 40 feet deep, right? Because that's the absolute value of a negative 15. This is the absolute value of a negative 40. Now, if I take these blue numbers and we just kind of put them next to the D and the H and put these up here, then I think that's going to help you to realize what symbol you need to use, because isn't 15 less than 40? To answer the question, who has more depth? Mrs. Hayes has more depth, right? Dietrich has a lesser depth than Hayes. Now, if we were to just talk about these, just not in terms of absolute value, but if we were actually going to talk about which number is lower, this would be a lower number. So if this was not an absolute value question and we were just comparing a negative 40 and a negative 15, and you were asked to put a symbol, wouldn't you be putting this symbol? This would be a lesser number. But in the context of absolute value, we're really talking about the distance, right? So that's the difference, and that's what makes these types of questions a little bit tricky.